The title of this study is Detecting Oral Contraceptives' Effect on Chronic Fatigue Through Determination of Vitamin B6 Related Blood Levels. We'll go over the problem, the findings, the method of assessment, the recommendations, the outcome, and the references. I had a 35-year-old female taking oral contraceptives for over 15 years who was experiencing chronic fatigue. She was a vegetarian, although she occasionally ate some sardines, which we know are high in B12. And she was taking just a daily synthetic generic type multivitamin. My findings uncovered oral contraceptives deplete vitamin B6, contributing to reduced energy production, resulting in chronic fatigue. And I'll go through that whole process here step by step so you can understand how I got to that point. The first step here, oral contraceptives deplete vitamin B6, and there's several studies that I have at the end that back that up. The pyridoxal 5-phosphate, PLP or P5P form of vitamin B6 is needed to synthesize heme to make hemoglobin. So therefore, decreased P5P results in decreased hemoglobin. And we know that hemoglobin inside red blood cells binds to oxygen, and red blood cells deliver oxygen to all cells of the body. So therefore, decreased hemoglobin results in decreased oxygen delivery. We also know that the mitochondria inside the cells use oxygen to make energy, or ATP. So therefore, decreased oxygen results in decreased energy production. And finally, the chronic lack of energy production can result in chronic fatigue. So LabSmarts identified that it was highly likely she had suboptimal blood oxygen delivery, possibly caused by heme synthesis dysfunction as a result of vitamin B6 insufficiency. And within LabSmarts, we do not use diagnostic terms, making it safe for nutrition consultants and other non-licensed practitioners to use the software. But if you were going to say this in diagnostic terms, it would be sideroblastic anemia caused by vitamin B6 insufficiency, specifically the acquired sideroblastic anemia and not the hereditary type. So in more detail, LabSmarts automated the analysis of blood chemistry patterns to determine the likelihood of anemia, the type of anemia, and the possible root causes of anemia. This is the red blood cell analysis section of LabSmarts where we uncovered these findings. So we first determined the likelihood of anemia. And we do this using red blood cells, hemoglobin, and hematocrit. And in this case, it looks like she was highly likely to have suboptimal blood oxygen delivery, anemia. The way you say that in the terms of these three markers would be, it's highly likely that the delivery of oxygen by the red blood cells to all cells of the body is suboptimal as a result of a lower than optimal number of red blood cells, those are the RBCs, a lower than optimal amount of hemoglobin in a liter of blood, that's what hemoglobin represents, and a lower than optimal percent of red blood cells in a liter of blood, that's what hematocrit represents. Next, we determine the type of anemia. So we first use MCV to determine the red blood cell size, and in this case, her red blood cell size were small, microcytic. Next, we use MCHC, mean corpuscular hemoglobin concentration, to determine the red blood cell color. That represents the amount of iron inside the red blood cell based on its size. And in this case, it was pale colored. That represents the term hypochromic. To say this in a sentence would be, the delivery of oxygen by the red blood cells to all cells of the body is suboptimal as a result of smaller than optimal red blood cells, microcytic, containing a lower than optimal amount of hemoglobin for their size, hypochromic. Now, this is the cool part. So we take it a step further and we look at a bunch of different markers and patterns to determine the possible root causes of anemia. And in this case, this is just an example because I always test the iron panel with ferritin, but in this case, if you didn't have the iron panel with ferritin, there would be multiple root causes of microcytic hypochromic anemia. It's not always just iron insufficiency. This is why we never recommend iron supplements for this type of anemia without knowing the iron panel values. So in this case, we did have the iron panel markers, and having those values narrowed down all those possible root causes to just this one here, heme synthesis dysfunction, possibly caused by vitamin B6 insufficiency. So the first part of that, heme synthesis dysfunction, was identified using these four markers. So we can see here that the amount of iron in the serum is more than optimal, and you can tell that the transferrin in the serum that carries around the iron is highly saturated with iron. So there's not a problem of iron deficiency, and also the amount of iron in storage form in ferritin is more than optimal. So there's definitely not an issue with iron intake here, but instead there's enough iron, more than enough iron, but it's not being able to be converted into heme to make hemoglobin. And the next part of this root cause is caused by vitamin B6 insufficiency, and we can tell that with these two markers, AST and ALT. Those liver markers are B6 dependent enzymes. When those are less than optimal, it's usually that there's not enough B6 to make those enzymes. Based on all these patterns, the software automatically narrows down the possible root causes for you very quickly to tell you that in this case, this client had the possible root cause that we uncovered earlier was that heme synthesis dysfunction, possibly caused by vitamin B6 insufficiency, sideroblastic anemia. So what I did based on studies that I found for sideroblastic anemia and how it can be corrected with large amounts of vitamin B6 in the P5P form, I recommended that she take 100 milligrams of P5P twice a day for 2 months. And also, because I'm a nutrition consultant, I asked her to eat foods rich in B6. Although she was a vegetarian, I had to eliminate the foods that were meat and dairy, which are high in B6. So we were left with salmon and sweet potatoes, and these others. And also I found this study where broccoli and cauliflower have some B6 in it, but you want to eat it in the raw form because when it's frozen, it has high amounts of pyridoxine glycoside, which is a form of B6 with greatly reduced bioavailability. So you're better off eating it in the raw form. I also recommended a B complex, a better multivitamin, vitamin D, and vitamin C. The outcome was great. So she had noticeable improvement in energy after just 2 weeks. And after the 2 months, we reran her blood work and the anemia was gone. Here are the references. There are studies that support the oral contraceptives deplete vitamin B6 information, studies that support the P5P is needed for heme synthesis, information and education that I've taken around blood chemistry analysis that support the patterns that I'm using. There's studies that support the B6 supplement protocol for sideroblastic anemia that I used, and information and studies around the B6 rich foods and the reduced availability of pyridoxine glucoside. This is the abstract of the study, which is a nice summary of everything we just reviewed.